the first migratory bird sanctuaries, MBS, designated under the Migratory Birds Convention Act were the Bird Rocks and Bonaventure Island and Pass Rock Sanctuaries, established in 1919, in Quebec. However, the first protected area established for the conservation of migratory birds in Canada was Last Mountain Lake in 1887, in southern Saskatchewan, a refuge for birds that later became a migratory bird sanctuary, in 1921, as well as a national wildlife area, in 1994. At present, there are 92 MBS across Canada, comprising almost 11.5 million hectares of migratory bird habitat that provides safe refuge for migratory birds in the terrestrial and marine environment. The Canadian Wildlife Service of Environment Canada is the agency responsible for MBS, although the sanctuaries can be located on federal, provincial or private land. MBS are listed under the schedule in the Migratory Bird Sanctuary Regulations, which prescribe rules and prohibitions regarding the taking, injuring, destruction or molestation of migratory birds or their nests or eggs in the sanctuaries. Hunting of listed species under the Act is not permitted in any migratory bird sanctuary. The Inglewood Bird Sanctuary and Nature Centre have been providing migratory birds with a place to rest their wings since 1929. That's more than 80 years of conservation. To date, 270 species of birds, 21 species of mammals and 347 species of plants have been recorded at the Sanctuary and Nature Centre by members of the public, volunteers and staff. The Inglewood Bird Sanctuary and Nature Centre have been providing migratory birds with a place to rest their wings since 1929. That's more than 80 years of conservation. To date, 270 species of birds, 21 species of mammals and 347 species of plants have been recorded at the Sanctuary and Nature Centre by members of the public, volunteers and staff. History. In 1883, Colonel James Walker settled the land that is now occupied by the sanctuary. In 1910, the current brick house, then named Inglewood, was built, and the surrounding area was named for the most prominent property in the area. From 1929 to 1952, several Chinese families leased land from Colonel Walker and established market gardens to serve the needs of a growing city. These highly productive gardens were used to grow vegetables and bedding plants, and represent an early example of urban agriculture and horticulture in the city. As part of the engagement process for Bend in the Bow, it was discovered the descendants of one of the families, the Koo family, still reside in Calgary. Colonel Walker's son, Selby, applied to the federal government in 1929 to have 59 acres on the west side of the Bow River be designated as a federal migratory bird sanctuary. His request was granted and the Inglewood Bird Sanctuary was born. When Selby died in 1953, Ed Jeffries acquired the property and leased it to the Alberta Fish and Game Association. In 1970, the city of Calgary purchased the property and has been managing it as a natural reserve ever since. The Sanctuary's Nature Centre was built in 1996 and grassland restoration projects began in that same year. The Colonel Walker House is currently used by parks staff and volunteers as a classroom and office. Geese winging their way south in wrinkled V-shaped flocks is perhaps the classic picture of migration. The annual, large-scale movement of birds between their breeding, summer, homes and their non-breeding, winter, grounds. But geese are far from our only migratory birds. Of the more than 650 species of North American breeding birds, more than half are migratory. Why do birds migrate? Birds migrate to move from areas of low or decreasing resources to areas of high or increasing resources. The two primary resources being sought are food and nesting locations. Birds that nest in the northern hemisphere tend to migrate northward in the spring to take advantage of burgeoning insect populations, budding plants and an abundance of nesting locations. As winter approaches and the availability of insects and other food drops, the birds move south again. Escaping the cold is a motivating factor, but many species, including hummingbirds, can withstand freezing temperatures as long as an adequate supply of food is available. Types of migration. The term migration describes periodic, large-scale movements of populations of animals. One way to look at migration is to consider the distances traveled. Origins of long-distance migration. While short-distance migration probably developed from a fairly simple for food, the origins of long-distance migration patterns are much more complex. They've evolved over thousands of years and are controlled at least partially by the genetic makeup of the birds. They also incorporate responses to weather, geography, food sources, day length, and other factors. How do birds prepare for long migrations? The new migration science. For birds that winter in the tropics, it seems strange to imagine leaving home and embarking on a migration north. Why make such an arduous trip north in spring? One idea is that through many generations the tropical ancestors of these birds dispersed from their tropical breeding sites northward. The seasonal abundance of insect food and greater day length allowed them to raise more young, 4 to 6 on average, than their stay-at-home tropical relatives, 2 to 3 on average. As their breeding zones moved north during periods of glacial retreat, the birds continued to return to their tropical homes as winter weather and declining food supplies made life more difficult. Supporting this theory is the fact that most North American vireos, flycatchers, tanagers, warblers, orioles, and swallows have evolved from forms that originated in the tropics. What triggers migration? The mechanisms initiating migratory behavior vary and are not always completely understood. Migration can be triggered by a combination of changes in day length, lower temperatures, changes in food supplies, and genetic predisposition. For centuries, people who have kept caged birds have noticed that the migratory species go through a period of restlessness each spring and fall, repeatedly fluttering toward one side of their cage. German behavioral scientists gave this behavior the names Unruhe, meaning migratory restlessness. Different species of birds and even segments of the population within the same species may follow different migratory patterns. It's a bird watcher's boon, but it's also crucial information for conservation. By knowing where birds are and when, important conservation decisions can be made, such as placement of wind turbines and reducing building lights on specific high migration nights, to prevent the deaths of millions of birds. Accurate migration models also have broader applications, allowing researchers to understand behavioral aspects of migration. How migration timing and pathways respond to changing climate, and whether linkages exist between variation in migration timing and subsequent changes in population size. Birdcasters use weekly migration forecasts each spring and fall migration season. How do birds navigate? Migrating birds can cover thousands of miles in their annual travels, often traveling the same course year after year with little deviation. First-year birds often make their very first migration on their own. Somehow they can find their winter home despite never having seen it before, and return the following spring to where they were born. The secrets of their amazing navigational skills aren't fully understood, partly because birds combine several different types of senses when they navigate. Birds can get compass information from the sun, the stars, and by sensing the Earth's magnetic field. They also get information from the position of the setting sun and from landmarks seen during the day. There's even evidence that sense of smell plays a role, at least for homing pigeons. Some species, particularly waterfowl and cranes, follow preferred pathways on their annual migrations. These pathways are often related to important stopover locations that provide food supplies critical to the bird's survival. Smaller birds tend to migrate in broad fronts across the landscape. Migration hazards. Taking a journey that can stretch to a round-trip distance of several thousand miles is a dangerous and arduous undertaking. It is an effort that tests both the bird's physical and mental capabilities. The physical stress of the trip, lack of adequate food supplies along the way, bad weather, and increased exposure to predators all add to the hazards of the journey. In recent years, long-distance migrants have been facing a growing threat from communication towers and tall buildings. Many species are attracted to the lights of tall buildings and millions are killed each year in collisions with the structures. The Fatal Light Awareness Program, based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, has more about this problem. Studying migration map of crane migration stopover sites along Platte River. Each spring, about 500,000 sandhill cranes and some endangered whooping cranes use Nebraska's Platte River as a staging habitat during their northward migration. Scientists use several techniques in studying migration, including banding, satellite tracking, and a relatively new method involving lightweight devices known as geolocators. One of the goals is to locate important stopover and wintering locations. Once identified, steps can be taken to protect and save these key locations. Each spring approximately 500,000 sandhill cranes and some endangered whooping cranes use the central Platte River Valley in Nebraska as a staging habitat during their migration north to breeding and nesting grounds in Canada, Alaska, and the Siberian Arctic. What is a migrant trap? Giant live oak trees, like these in High Island, Texas, attract many of our most beautiful birds after their spring journey across the Gulf of Mexico. Clockwise from top left, Baltimore oriole, indigo bunting, chestnut-sided warbler, bay-breasted warbler, blue grosbeak, scarlet tanager, black-throated green warbler, orchard oriole, black and white warbler, Blackburnian warbler. Some places seem to have a knack for concentrating migrating birds in larger than normal numbers. These migrant traps often become well known as birding hotspots. This is typically the result of local weather conditions, an abundance of food, or the local topography. For example, small songbirds migrating north in the spring fly directly over the Gulf of Mexico, landing on the coastlines of the Gulf Coast states. When storms or cold fronts bring headwinds, these birds can be near exhaustion when they reach land. In such cases they head for the nearest location offering food and cover, typically live oak groves on barrier islands, where very large numbers of migrants can collect in what's known as a fallout. These migration traps have become very popular with birders, even earning international reputations. Peninsulas can also concentrate migrating birds as they follow the land and then pause before launching over water. This explains why places like Point Pelly, Ontario, the Florida Keys, Point Reyes, California, and Cape May, New Jersey, have great reputations as migration hotspots. Spring migration is an especially good time for those that feed birds in their backyard to attract species they normally do not see. offering a variety of food sources, water, and adding natural food sources to the landscape can make a backyard attractive to migrating songbirds. Range maps. Animated occurrence map for common yellowthroat. This map shows the common yellowthroat's US range for each week of the calendar year. You'll find animated maps for more species at your bird. It's always a good idea to use the range maps in your field guide to determine if and when a particular species might be around. Range maps are especially useful when working with migratory species. However, they can be confusing. Ranges of birds can vary year to year, as with eruptive species such as redpills. Also, the ranges of some species can expand or contract fairly rapidly, with changes occurring in time periods shorter than the republication time of a field guide. The Eurasian collared dove is the best example of this problem. These limitations are beginning to be addressed by data-driven, digital versions of range maps. The maps are made possible by the hundreds of millions of eBird observations submitted by birdwatchers around the world. Big data analyses are allowing scientists to produce animated maps that show a species ebb and flow across the continent throughout a calendar year, as well as understand larger patterns of movement.